Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135. And to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them, and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which formed part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 9th of the 9, and is a conversation between Hashi Mohamed, Kathryn Ventham, and Simon Mirams about the flood risk sequential test. Hashi is a barrister and author at Landmark Chambers. Kathryn is a planning director at Stantec, and Simon is a director at Rappor. Their conversation takes in the implications of policy changes in relation to flood risk, recent relevant case law, the EA's new flood maps for planning, and tips for practitioners faced with undertaking sequential tests because of surface water. Enjoy.
So we're here to discuss this vexed issue of flooding and the recent changes in the MPPF. I thought I would center our discussions around the recent changes to the MPPF and then ask you guys how much of this is an experience for you at the minute. So what we know from the new National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 175, is it says the sequential test should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding, except in situations where a site-specific flood risk assessment demonstrates that no built development within the site boundary, including access or escape routes, land raising, or other potential vulnerable elements, would be located on an area that would be at risk of flooding from any source, now and in the future, open bracket, having regard to potential changes in flood risk. So Simon, to you first. I mean, how much of an issue now, in light of that wording, is it for the clients that you're dealing with who now have to confront this idea that any source of flooding, whether that be fluvial or surface water, could trigger the sequential test?
In simple terms, it's huge. It's probably cropping up on 90-95% of the sites I'm working on in some extent. I think the change in the wording helped in some ways, but I think it's caused more confusion and sort of included a bit more subjectivity around what is classified, what isn't, what's development, what's not. Are surface water attenuation basins, is that development, is it not? And I think it's asked more questions. I think it's a very small step in the right direction, but for me, it should go further. And I think with the updates to the mapping as well, so the 18th of January surface water updates, it's knowing where the bar is to compare it to, because it seems that at the moment, an ever-changing sort of data set to make those assessments and make those judgments that might be right this week, but next week it might be different again.
Yeah. And for you, Kathryn, I mean, you've worked on so many projects at the same time. How many times are you now having to relook at a layout and overlay it with the flood maps and say, actually, guys, I'm really sorry, but whatever house you thought could go there might not be able to be going there anymore?
Sure. I mean, I've probably done that several times this week already, unfortunately. I think the one advantage that 175 has had is it has stopped the artificial carving up of sites that we were having to do previously. So the fact that, just the mere presence of maybe a bit of flood zone 2 land in your site previously meant you had to do a sequential test, even if you weren't touching it, for example, that's now gone. So in one respect, it's beneficial. But as Simon said, the fact that Yeah, for me personally, it's surface water which is causing the problem, and it's the fact that, as you said, Simon, it's, what does land raising mean? And it's the access problem as well. I've already done, an inquiry this year, which we're still awaiting, but just on surface water, just on sequential testing for, a part of a site where just a small internal access road crossed a medium high level bit of surface water, which triggered the requirement for a sequential test. So in one respect, it's helpful. It stopped the carve up. In other respects, we're still having to do an awful lot of them, because it's very hard to design your sites around surface water flooding. Very, very hard.
Simon, we had the Environment Agency update the flood maps once already earlier this year, and again likely to happen later this year. Just give us an idea of what that actually means. What have they updated, and what do people need to understand about these recent changes?
Yeah, it's a big update. It's a national one. It's the National Flood Risk Assessment that the Environment Agency have looked at the method, the modelling they've done, and run a whole new assessment for national scale. The headlines of it are that for the present day, it's 6.3 million properties, existing properties, at risk. When you put climate change in, that is a new feature of it, it rises to about 8 million. So going back to Kathryn's point about surface water, you can see there's a massive increase over the next 40, 50 years of predicted debts. So that's going to have a knock-on on sites coming forward, everything like that. And then we've got the big update, which is the flood map for planning on the 25th. So that's from today, it's Tuesday, so it's a couple of days away. My understanding
What are we expecting to see from that?
it's completely new flood zone mapping. I've had a sneak peek in some areas, and it does seem to be largely an increase in the flood extents. It's a new flood zone 2, a new flood zone 3, and the key here is that the EA is saying in all the documents I've seen that the existing mapping as it is today is going to be retired, is archived. We're already having local authorities that have for the last month said they're not going to send us modelling data because they've been told from the 25th it will be retired, and that might be more detailed than what they're using to do the mapping. So again, until we know what's coming out, as an element of the unknown, but I'm hoping when it comes out, it will speed up some of the decision making.
So just to be clear, so I can understand this. So are they going to produce something that will retire the previous maps as we understood it? New maps to help us understand what the lay of the land, quite literally in some respect. But does that then mean, for example, if you've been undertaking a significant amount of modeling and assessments based on those previous maps, are you likely to then start again? Or do we know what that is likely to look like?
It's a very good question, and at the moment, there's no one that seems to actually know the answer. The EA are being relatively tight-lipped until the data is released. My view is that it will certainly involve conversations, and there will be further work to be had. Certainly in terms of updating the flood map, detailed modelling. Is that more detailed than their data? If so, we've got to have a review process. The EA is struggling with resourcing as it is. So it's going to add time, delays to go through that process. If at all, it might be you have to shelve the work that has been done up until the 25th, and the EA take the position that their modelling is more up to date.
Yeah.
And if you do that, again, that's wasted time that people have already spent.
Kathryn, your reaction to that? I mean, in practical terms, what would that do to the kind of work streams you're currently engaged in?
I mean, firstly, it's just a wider planning issue. Obviously, that has a huge impact on timescales and costs from a client perspective. But also, because again, it's inherently linked. The flood mapping is inherently linked to the sequential testing. And in many of the sort of, a lot of the ones that Simon and I do together, and I do with other people as well, you're having to kind of rank sites potentially on the basis of percentage of different types of flooding within your site and within the adjoining sites. And when you're in some instances considering, you're having a starting point of, hundreds of sites, then obviously again that's a huge, sequential testing is a very manual process, unfortunately, at the moment. Has a huge impact on the timescales, and again the cost for the client for that as well, and potentially undoes work that might have been going on for months.
Yeah, and just let's help people understand what does the actual sequential test mean, Kathryn? I mean, we know that different local authorities have different methodologies. We know that different local authorities might approach it slightly differently. It's always advisable to an applicant to approach a local authority to try and agree a methodology so that you go off to then figure out whether or not your site is sequentially more preferable than another site, and therefore the sequential test has been passed. But just in layman's terms, just explain what does the actual mechanics of that exercise, because it can be quite laborious.
It can be very, very laborious, and in many so just the sort of starting point really is that, particularly if it's a housing scheme, we'll take housing because that's probably in some instances the hardest one to do, is that if you're generally the view is if you're coming forward with a housing scheme and that housing scheme is meeting district-wide needs, then in many instances your starting point can be that you've got to survey the whole district or the whole borough. In some instances, you can get agreement that it should be settlement specific, particularly if you've maybe got settlement specific targets in the plan. But in a number of cases, it is the whole district or the whole borough. And so, the problem that we're sort of generally finding is that historically, I mean, if you think about this, up until 2022, I'd gone through 20 years of planning, never having had to do a flood risk sequential test. And now they're all over the place. And historically, I think you generally find that if you're dealing with a coastal authority that's maybe had to grapple with tidal flooding or tidal flooding mapping, for example, then they'll generally be set up with a policy in the plan which talks about the sequential test. If you get to the middle of the country, Coventry or somewhere like that, then it's historically it's never really been an issue for them to have to grapple with it. So you generally find there's just a complete absence of policy in the plan because we've never previously had to sort of do it for surface water flooding, things like that. So actually you are, in many cases, often having to start with just a complete absence of policy. And there's nothing really in the framework either to tell you actually how to do it. So you can start off with, with hundreds of sites. And we'll come on to talk about the recent appeal shortly. I can explain how we went about it there. But your pool sometimes can be hundreds of sites wide. And then you have to go through several sieving layers to get there.
And I'll come back to what the PPG might be able to assist us with on that front. But
Yes.
your thoughts on that, Simon, in terms of the task and how it differs from different local authorities and your approach to this from a technical perspective.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with what Kathryn said. It is you can have a site that's half a mile away from another one and have a very different methodology, a very different agreed approach to do it. I think for me, in terms of the flood risk side of things and the technical side, it comes down to the accuracy of the data that is being used and the way that the people are interpreting that data. I think the surface water mapping, we have to accept it is coarse. It doesn't include necessarily culverts. It doesn't include ditches. It assumes they're full. All things like that can actually give a really skewed view of the risk to the site. And people and local authorities are making big decisions with full faith in that modelling and in that data set without knowing the assumptions and limitations that have gone into the building of it. And again, I think that is all something that needs to be put into the mix, that quite often it's that segregation of it's a planning thing, it's not a flood risk thing. Actually, where we need to be, and I know Kathryn and I have talked about this at length, is it's both. It is a flood risk sequential test. It's not a sequential test and flood risk. And I think that's where a mindset change is needed to try and find a pragmatic solution to it, to overcome it. Sustainable development's what we all want. Development's what we want for most of our clients. And it's just finding that way that the two can be interlinked to make a solution, not a problem.
Yeah. Now, we'll come back to what we would like to see in the PPG in just a moment. But I just thought it worth reading out when the July MPPF was being consulted upon, and then obviously the new MPPF came out in December. This was what the government's response was to the July MPPF consultation, which stated, and I quote, "After considering the comments received in relation to reasonably available sites, we will shortly be updating planning practice guidance to clarify the definition of reasonably available sites that should be considered as part of the sequential test." Now, we don't have that guidance just now, but just in terms of how useful it would be to have that guidance and maybe help with the approach in different local authorities. Will that be sufficient? Your thoughts on that, Simon?
I think it would be helpful. I do, but I think again, it needs to be a consistent approach throughout, and I think that's the guidance will help. But again, it comes down to that interpretation, doesn't it? And so often that's what comes down to it. What is reasonably available? Do you need to write to every landowner? Do you need to look at sites that are been in a, I don't know, in a schlar or something like that? It's that specific definition that can apply nationally that I think is what's needed to help narrow down that search. As Kathryn said, you can start with hundreds and you can actually end up going through and whittling a load of them out and getting down to 12, 13 as a number.
Yeah. And Kathryn, your thoughts on that as well? I mean, will that be sufficient? Do we need more guidance? I mean,
I think we need more, it will help. From my perspective, I think any guidance helps on sequential testing because, again, we were involved with the Mead realisations in the Redrow case, and one of the things that actually Lord Justice Holgate, as he now is, said verbally was that there is a complete dearth of guidance on how to do these things, and he had every sympathy with all of us that were trying to do them. Just some clarification because you can take it to the extreme. So I say that it should be reasonably available to the appellant or the applicant when I'm doing my sequential test. I will say I've come across, counsels on the other side who will argue that the definition should be reasonably available to somebody. Now, those two are a long way apart in terms of, in terms of how you should approach it. And obviously, the problem is if you've got something that's so far apart as the starting sort of definitions, really, then actually trying to kind of find an agreed position, you're probably not going to get there. You're going to end up with sites in dispute because you're coming at it from very different perspectives.
yeah. And that's what you argued in your recent appeal. We'll come back to just a moment. Now, let's just then think about what are the consequences for anybody who's dealing with this. If, say, for example, you undertook a sequential test and you passed it, what that means is that under paragraph 11D of the MPPF, it just means that footnote 7, which disapplies that tilted balance, does not bite. And so you would benefit from a tilted balance if that is available to you. It may be that you're in a place where only the flat balance is available to you. But let's say a tilted balance is available to you. Footnote 7, for areas at risk of flooding, it disapplies. But if you pass the test, you're back in. Now, in the event that you fail and you're not benefiting from a tilted balance and you're therefore faced with a flat balance, the Mead judgment that you referred to, Kathryn, tells us then that harm should be one that's carried as part of a balancing exercise. It isn't necessarily determinative of the appeal. So with that kind of context, introduce this recent appeal decision that you've been involved in, Kathryn, to kind of guide us on this part of the discussion.
Okay, so Simon and I were both involved with an appeal decision, which I think came out on the 18th of March now. It's at a site in Yatton in North Somerset. It's a flood zone 3A site, so the fact that we had to do a flood risk sequential test was never in doubt. That was always going to be the case. And in that instance, the agreed survey area or potential survey area in that case was the whole of North Somerset, so large survey area. And just to give some context, that initial pulling the data of the sites together, and when I said sequential testing is very laborious, we started off with 507 sites as our initial pool of sites. So Simon's nodding, exactly that. It was a huge amount of sites that we had to do. And we had to go through we went through, basically we go through various stages of sieving sites out on, whether or not the sites are too small, and there's an issue about can you group sites together to form a series of sites. So we went through a phase of drawing up the parameters, sieving out sites, and fundamentally by the time we got to the start of the inquiry, there were 36 sites in dispute between myself and the council's witness on that, as I said, from a starting point of 504. That the problem that we had there was so that the methodology was submitted to council 2 years before the inquiry started, and we didn't get any feedback on it. So we went into the inquiry with me saying we were the most sequentially preferable site, and the council saying no, there are 36 sites which are sequentially preferable to you. What did what was helpful in that respect is that the authority that we are dealing with there, it's North Somerset Council, they are very used to dealing with sequential testing, and they were also involved with the Mead judgment, because that site was the site that was the subject of that. One of them was in North Somerset. What they did agree was that in the event that that we failed the sequential test, they agreed with us that it was a matter for the planning balance. So that's how we approached that case, which was to say that, okay, we may be different in terms of our approach to the sequential test, and the conclusion, what we are agreed is that the outcome is that if we fail, it goes into the planning balance, and then it was a matter of, where I concluded that site, or where I concluded that matter sat in the weights in the balancing table, and where the council concluded, and they effectively said, as you would expect from their side, that it was a determinative matter, and we said no, it wasn't. We still had the view that our benefits outweighed our harms, and that's the conclusion the inspector came to as well.
Yeah, which is ultimately what the inspector found. I wanted to come back to you in just a moment about what does it mean to be sequentially preferable when you get the current PPG. Just your thoughts on the decision first, Simon.
Yeah, no, obviously delighted with the decision. It was one where it was nice to see that the exception test was also brought in, which is probably where I sit a lot of it. So that is the making sure it's safe. So for me, that's a big part of the planning balance. Is it sustainable development? For me, sustainable development is one that doesn't flood. It is safe. It follows the criteria it needs to, the design life, access and egress, everything like that. And again, it was one that even during the inquiry, the council were raising concerns over work that had been done over a 24-month period. So going back to your point, Hashi, about the mapping and it's changing, it was an ever-changing sort of challenge that was being presented, and it was nice that it was a complicated site with flood defences, climate change, REAN network, IDB, Internal Drainage Board, Environment Agency, North Somerset. So the fact that the inspector was able to see through and say, actually, if we break this down, is the site safe? Can it be accessed throughout its design life? And he concluded yes. For me, it's a real step in the right direction of some sort of a common sense approach to assessing flood risk to development.
Yeah, and just to give people a bit more detail about this appeal decision. So one of the things first thing is the appellants for whom you guys were acting did not obviously reach a common ground on the methodology with the council, particularly around areas of search, site size, land type, etc. But this is what the inspector said at paragraph 50 of that decision, which I thought was quite interesting on this point about what's sequentially preferable. I'll just read this bit worth it. Looking at paragraph 728, he says, of PPG as a whole, the focus is on the location of alternative sites and the prospect that they are available to be developed. The appellant, he means you, the inspector means you, Kathryn, infers that this means available to the developed by this appellant. I see no basis for making that inference. I agree with the council that a reasonably available site should be available to be developed by someone. I do not share the appellant's view that the council's approach is overly restrictive or that it leads to an absurd result. So long as a site is available to be developed by someone, it can contribute to meeting housing needs. I have therefore discounted the sites on the basis that they are currently controlled by another developer or a land promoter. Just give us a bit more of a flavor of the kind of arguments for what you were saying, and whether or not that's something that could be put before another inspector at another time that might lead to a different result, Kathryn.
Sure. I mean, so as I said, we had sort of very opposing views on this, and this is where I think the PPG would help. We so the way that we approach it, or way we approached it here, is we didn't just simply say, okay, the site is under the, we were working for one house builder. We didn't just simply say, okay, that site is under option or under the control of another house builder, and therefore we can't take it forward, because that, in my view, is too simplistic a view. Because I think going down that approach, it would make it too easy to pass. But what we did was we wrote, we've written to everybody. We've said, is your site available? And some people write back, and you continue that discussion. And some people sort of, you don't hear from again. So I do take, obviously I understand what he is saying there, but I think it's important to say that when you do the flood risk sequential test, most sites, you don't discount. I don't end up discounting on a single reason only. So that's the whole purpose of the sieving process. There might be a point at which a site falls out. Usually the kind of definitive point is that actually if the site is wetter than yours, then you can get rid of it. But for example, I don't necessarily think it comes through in here, but I didn't necessarily discount a site purely because I had written to another developer and they hadn't responded, and therefore I got rid of the site, because I don't think that's how you should approach it. So he is right. He says, I have not therefore discounted sites on the basis they're currently controlled by another developer. Well, nor did we. I took the view that actually there were other factors, whether it be site size, whether it be that actually the site might not be in the right place, or whether the site was wetter than ours. So it's I always take the view that it's a combination of factors. So coming back to your point, I don't think people should be scared by that paragraph, because that wording is actually consistent with what we did. We didn't just discount a site because it was under the control of someone else. It's a factor, and it might be the main reason I discounted it, but there's generally always something else which sits alongside it. So the Pikachu would help, but it's not something to be worried about.
That's really important point, and it doesn't come across very clearly in that particular paragraph, but that's a really important point, that a site could be discounted for a whole host of reasons, and not just for the fact that it's controlled by one developer over another, meeting the need for housing in a district, for example. Now, Simon, in terms of the technical side of things, one of the things that Kathryn just said was you might discount a site, for example, because it's more wetter than yours. Or just give us an idea of the sequential test in practical terms, based on if, for example, you have a bit more surface water where you are, but there are a bunch of other sites that have got fluvial problems and flood zone 3, or whatever it might be. What are the other factors that help discount sites as not being sequentially preferable?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, actually. So what we would normally do is rank it on flood risk from fluvial, tidal and surface water sources, but increasingly we're finding, so for Wiltshire, for example, we'll bring in groundwater. As it stands, there is no hierarchy as to which one is more appropriate or not. And I think it goes back to, I know we're going to talk about what we want to see in PPG, but I think it's that sort of general sort of any sources of flooding kind of leads itself to give a tool for people to query the data and not sort of rely more heavily on fluvial or tidal. For me, on the technical side, it should be an assessment that's done as part of the flood risk assessment to understand which is the dominant source of flooding. So, for example, if we're going to go back to Yatton, there was surface water flooding at the site, but it was considered that the tidal was more dominant because that was the one that was likely to have the biggest impact. But that is not factored into anything in terms of the wording or the guidance around the sequential test, and it is that trigger of any source on the site, therefore they're all classified the same, whether it's 1% or 99%.
Interesting. And just in terms of then other factors, Kathryn, could you just give us a bit more of a flavor, not just ownership, but obviously there's a question about size. I've seen one example in Spelthorne where the scope was really narrowed because of the use, because it was a care home by a provider in the particular location, and that helped to narrow the sequential testing in that context. But just give us other factors that are relevant for your aspects.
So I think, and you're right. When you're dealing with something like a care home, then I think that's it's easier to narrow the scope. As I said, it's almost easiest to talk about it with housing, because actually housing is the one that arguably is the hardest to pass. But for example, one of the big things that I always tell people not to forget is that what came out of the Mead Redrow judgment is that you can consider what's called the range of interconnected benefits, which is there something that you can deliver or that you are delivering on your site, which means that actually you can massively reduce the scope of sites that you have to assess. So, for example, an appeal that I won last month, where we were considered to be the most sequentially preferable site, it was a housing site. We did the sequential test, but as part of what we were doing, we were also delivering upgrades to the adjoining site next door, which was a golf course, and providing golf course enhancements. So we had to do the sequential test, but in reality, no other site could deliver those benefits to that golf course because we were directly connected to it, same landowner, etc. So there we did the scope, but in reality it was accepted. It was a race of one horse, and the inspector accepted that and therefore concluded in that decision that we passed the sequential test. So is there something that you can deliver that's a real benefit that actually other people can't? As you said, site size is also important. That there's been this decision and a couple of others now does accept that you've got to sort of have some parameters somewhere as to sites that you can consider. We generally apply 25%, but in some instances you can get that range down. And then it's also, if the council are saying to you, oh, we can have lots of small disparate sites, and actually, you can put those all together. Again, what came out of the media judgment was that those sites have to have some kind of relationship to them. So it's not sufficient to have identified multiple sites dotted around the district or the borough and to say that collectively those can deliver the same. Those sites do have to have some form of relationship. So there is, even when you start with the Atom, where we had over 500 sites, you can get that list down relatively quickly. It's just that it's quite a daunting process to start with when you look at that many sites.
Yeah, I can imagine. Simon, finally, just your thoughts on what you would like to see in the PPG. I mean, we've already talked about the clarity that we need for understanding what it means to be a sequentially more preferable. Any other thoughts? Presumably, an understanding of the hierarchy of whether fluvial, tidal, surface water, groundwater, just an understanding of one is more important than the other, for example?
Absolutely. I think that would be really helpful. And again, it's solving those sort of subjective points in the guidance and making it really crystal clear. I mean, if I was to go one step further, in an ideal world, I would also look at it and think where we are in terms of residential development. Could we argue that if the exception test is passed by default, then you meet the sequential test? And I know at the moment the policy is you've got to do the sequential test before you should even consider the exception test. But I think there is so many sites and cases, Yatton being just one, where actually there is a solution to the flood risk problem that can then meet Para 175 in terms of no development. But we just have to have that initial step in there to demonstrate why it's safe. And I think that's why, going back to Yatton, that decision's quite helpful in that it is now there that the sequential can be failed and the exception test, amongst other things, can tip it in the balance. So for me, that's what I would like to see. Probably a little bit ambitious, but yeah, that's what I'd like.
And what about you, Kathryn?
I think I've probably got four things. I think the first one is, number one is probably linked to Simon's point in it. It's sort of, I would, at the moment, you referenced the government response to this matter in July. Obviously what that says is you shouldn't take mitigation into consideration. I would like to think that actually fundamentally, even when you're doing a sequential test, the fundamental point is safety. And actually, if my mitigation can, or if the mitigation that Simon or his colleagues draw up, if that can make the site safe, then surely that's the primary target. So I would like to see consideration of mitigation. I would like to see, as far as the paragraph 175 goes, I'd like to see the access taken out of there, because that does cause problems, because it can be just, it's really hard. You have the potential in some instances, and I've got sites where schemes are being artificially designed, and actually you may not get the best scheme, but you're actually artificially designing it to try and avoid doing a sequential test. I'd like to see a pragmatic approach to reasonably available. And I'd also, but this is really wishful thinking, I'd love to see a methodology, to be honest, but we've never had one for 5-year housing land supply, really. So I think I'm probably, that's probably wishful thinking. And I appreciate there's always a bit of, it's quite difficult to design a methodology for something that is where so many site-specific factors can be taken into.
Yeah, the variables
Exactly.
are so large.
Exactly. It's so hard.
Before we close, I just want to come back on a point that Kathryn said about it's an egress. I think it's an important point, and it's one I should have raised, is I completely agree it should be taken out, because yes, it's a trigger for it if you've got an access route in the floodplain, flood risk, surface water. However, there is guidance out there that says an access can be safe even if it's flooding. So again, I just wanted to sort of reinforce it from a technical side. Completely agree with Kathryn on the access. You've got one hand says you can flood to a certain depth, to a certain hazard, and be acceptable, but then that triggers a sequential test, so you shouldn't even be looking at how you do the access. So again, that's just another sort of contradiction.
This is going back to the suggestion that we should, but then what you're asking for is for the PPG to then tell us something completely different to what we've got in the MPPF. So I guess you're going to have to wait until Christmas to get a new MPPF. So if the previous, but I agree with you. Access and escape routes is another one on there in the 175 paragraph. I completely agree with you that so many sites I'm aware of currently where the sequential test is effectively triggered purely on the basis of the access. There must have been a logic to having added the access. What do we suppose is the logic behind that? I mean, that's the bit I don't understand.
I mean, I would say, well, arguably what they seem to have tried to cover is sort of all forms of development effectively. So I don't know whether it's just because they just wanted to make it clear that it wasn't just a house or a building. And I guess maybe because, when you talk about exception testing and things like that, that talks about access. So whether it was that link, I'm not sure. I'm not. That's my only thoughts.
I think it goes into the exception test point of ensuring the users are safe. It's one thing to ensure a development and the actual bricks and mortar are safe, but it's another thing to ensure the users are safe, and if needs be, people can get to them to ensure they're safe, so emergency vehicles, etc. But again, as I said, there's guidance that says it can flood as long as it's safe and it's managed appropriately, and then that brings in emergency planners, everything like that, and you can go down that route to agree it. So again, I'm not going to repeat myself, but yeah, I think it's safety.
Yeah. Sorry, Kathryn, you were going to say something.
No, I just had a question for you, actually. So, I'd just be interested for your view on something. So, one of the points that I've had raised with me, particularly post Yatel, is, well, if it's okay to fail it, then is it okay not to do it in the first place? Now, I have my view that unfortunately I think they're very different. They're very different things because in order to, because part of obviously sequential test is building up the cases to why it's okay to fail it as well. But I just wondered if you had a view on that, mindful that obviously we have seen this.
It's a very, very interesting take on that because I certainly would be advising most, if not all of my clients to undertake it purely because then at least where you stand, whether you fail or whether you pass, right? Then you can take a judgment on what you want to do next. But if the logic from your case to some people is, well, if I fail, it's going to be part of the balancing exercise, why bother doing it in the first place? That tells me, if I was acting for the council, is they've chosen not to do one because they know they're going to fail. But the bigger problem for you, Mr. or Mrs. Inspector, is you don't know how badly they were going to fail. You don't know how badly they were going to fail, and you don't know what weight you should be attached as to their bad result, which we don't know about. So insofar as them having failed is concerned, you've got to attach substantial weight to that simply because they haven't disabused you of that question. Whereas in your case, you failed, but you still probably beat a lot of sites in that 500 list. So an inspector's able to then judge what weight to attach to that question. Whereas if you don't do it at all, you could be number 500 or you could be number 150. No one will ever know. So I think to read that judgment in that way would be a bit too risky, I think.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Hashi, Kathryn, and Simon for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution, strategic planning, and local government reorganisation, CPO land value capture and benchmark land value, infrastructure planning, modernising planning committees, development and nature recovery, grey belt, statutory consultees, and design and placemaking. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.